In June of 2013, I emailed Clifford Carnicom at the Carnicom Institute offering to volunteer in whatever way I could. Some naysayers have claimed that our relationship began in a more nefarious way, but the truth is that I reached out to Clifford of my own volition, as others have over the years. I was aware in 2013 of both the chemtrails phenomenon and had a rough idea of what the mysterious Morgellons disease was about. Clifford was well known on the internet and in various activist communities for his work in both chemtrails and Morgellons, which he would prefer I refer to in a broader scope as geoengineering and bioengineering. And after becoming more intimately familiar with his work, I came to agree. But those were the labels I was familiar with at the time. I'll share more details about how I came to work with the Carnicom Institute. But the real focus of this video report is a mysterious person who I came to know through the Institute. It didn't occur to me at the time that he was going by a pseudonym, so I knew him only as Vincent Freeman. After having been working as a volunteer with Carnicom Institute for a few months, Vincent appeared. About 8 months later, he disappeared. Some interesting things happened and some bizarre things were uncovered while Vincent was around. Enough time has passed now that I think it's safe to tell the story, which is definitely worth telling. Returning to how I first came to work with the Carnicom Institute, I initiated contact by sending an email offering to volunteer. Here's the body of that message, which you can see provided a full page of what I hoped would be helpful background information and stated my intent. It also explained why I thought the areas they were working in were important in my estimation. Without gloating, I expressed admiration for Clifford's work, amongst other things. If you're a seasoned netizen with experience communicating with others through all the social media platforms out there, you might already know that there's a lot of confrontational and demotivational communication going on the internet. Some of that rhetoric is a natural result of our present society and partly the often anonymous nature of the communication. A large portion of it, however, is deliberate and organized efforts by various government and corporate agencies to disrupt discourse, discourage discussion of government corruption, or for other reasons. Discussion about topics that are more important to these government agencies receive more of this deliberate treatment. So it shouldn't surprise people familiar with all of this that Clifford Carnicom is one of the most controversial and defamed characters on the internet. In some ways, the volume of this type of information and attempts to discredit him is fairly moderate as a result of Clifford's reluctance to publicize himself or even his work. What I came to see for myself was his equal reluctance to publish any of his work prematurely. This was due in part to his humility and professionalism, but also the result of many barriers standing in his way. For example, very early on, Clifford established a website to begin publishing his work. As far back as 1999, he published an article in which he identified who was visiting his website regularly. Keep in mind that the year was 1999. With all due respect to activists or researchers on controversial topics, even today, what Clifford was experiencing trumps just about anyone's complaints of uncommon visitors. As we look at the list that Clifford posted back in 1999, let's listen to Vincent Freeman himself giving his thoughts on the issue.
In the earliest visitors, when Clifford first put up his website, there was very high-profile visitors to his website, which included companies like Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, as well as various pharmaceutical corporations, Monsanto, all sorts of people. And it's just one guy posting some photographs of the sky, and why would they all be interested? So, I mean, that would be a prime suspects list as far as I'm concerned. But, we can look at things like, Lockheed Martin, Los Alamos National Laboratory, Alliant Tech Systems, they make munitions, they do space systems. Raytheon, they're the ones that bought up the HARP patent from E-Systems. Raytheon bought E-Systems, which Bernard Eastland is the guy that made HARP. Boeing Aircraft Company. I'm just reading the list of visitors back when Clifford started the site.
Right.
Why would these people be so interested? The FAA, the Department of the Treasury visited, Rockwell Collins, Honeywell, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The Ames Research Center, that's an astrobiology research center. The Space Dynamics Laboratory, Merck, TRW, U.S. Navy, Air National Guard, Monsanto. We just have a who's who. Bristol Myers Squibb, that's another pharmaceutical company. So we have a whole list of a who's who of anybody in the defense world, along with that visited the site when it was just one guy posting pictures of the sky.
That clip was from the second hour of Vincent's appearance on Red Ice Radio, in which he both promoted and officially represented the Carnicom Institute. But before I explain how that situation came to pass, let's back up just slightly. It would be improper for me to share anything about the inner workings of the Carnicom Institute, but I am able to provide some general information. For instance, the Institute employees and volunteers would meet regularly via web conference. The offices of the Institute and where Clifford and others conduct the bulk of their research is currently in Idaho. For the most part, the base of volunteers is spread out throughout the U.S., so the Internet and related technologies are very important to the Institute's work. The Institute also has some established procedures, including for how a new member or volunteer joins the group. When my email was reviewed by a volunteer in charge of volunteer orientation, they contacted me about a telephone interview and further discussion. When we talked, I pitched the possibility that I could assist with modernizing the Institute's website, produce video material, and help to promote the work being done at the Institute. Within a short time, I was invited to join their regularly scheduled web conference to be introduced and begin getting the feel for the nature of the group. From there, I began to be integrated into various projects. As I said earlier, after a few months of work for the group and after becoming very familiar with the group members and the work being done, Clifford introduced Vincent. Clifford explained very vaguely that Vincent was joining the group in a unique way in which he would be reporting directly to Clifford. Clifford didn't give us any background on Vincent to my recollection, except to say that his assistance would be very helpful with research and laboratory experimentation that only few people in the group were qualified to do. I didn't think there was anything unusual about Vincent or the arrangement he had with the Institute. Before long, Vincent and I began communicating directly and collaborating on various projects. What I was struck by almost immediately was Vincent's breadth of knowledge. In retrospect, there wasn't a single topic that Vincent wasn't at least very familiar with, if not an expert in. And he was extremely helpful, despite his obviously heavy workload. For example, when I mentioned the lengthy render times I experienced when producing video material, Vincent offered to provide me with access to a render farm. In essence, he provided me with a location in which to upload all the related files, where banks of powerful computers would work together to render the video output at speeds experienced by movie studios when rendering complex CGI sequences. I have no idea how he was able to arrange such things, but it gives you a sense for how helpful he was. Vincent was also very willing to spend a lot of time explaining things you might be curious about or that he thought might be useful in your work. A couple months after he began working with the Institute, he shared a link to a website he had recently established, biocode.info. I'm unclear who he intended as an audience, but on the site he would publish his research largely for Carnicom Institute and would always credit the Institute when doing so. This is what the website looked like back then in early 2014. This is what the website looks like today, which looks to me to indicate he abandoned the domain some time ago. Vincent praised me for some of the research and video reports I had produced before joining the Institute. When I mentioned that I had worked with one particular well-known researcher, he expressed interest in speaking with them, so I passed along their contact information and they began to communicate. At the same time, I expressed to both Clifford and Vincent that this friend might be able to get the interest of some podcast and radio programs in the work we were doing. They both expressed interest and asked me to follow up. Right away, Red Ice Radio expressed interest in interviewing Clifford about both his work in geoengineering research and bioengineering research. To my surprise, Clifford suggested that Vincent be interviewed on behalf of the Institute. Nevertheless, Vincent was extremely knowledgeable in not just those areas but also Clifford's work at that time and dating back to the beginning. Vincent expressed a strong interest in doing the best possible job of representing the Institute and conveying the information we wanted promoted, and he solicited any ideas or suggestions from the group. Let's listen to an excerpt from Red Ice Radio in which Vincent explains his background. This clip is around 5.5 minutes in length, but it's a really key clip because it includes both Henrik's bio on Vincent as well as Vincent's explanation of his background and why he came to work for Carnicom. Pay particular attention to Vincent's description of what his work for the military-industrial complex involved.
Vincent Freeman is a molecular biologist and artificial intelligence scientist who has worked on classified programs at some of the top 50 defense contractors. He has also conducted genetic and biological analysis for the National Institute of Health, the NIH. Vincent is currently volunteering his time as a senior consultant to the Carnicom Institute, a non-profit research organization whose goal is to identify and expose covert geoengineering and bioengineering. Vincent's current project involves reverse engineering the fundamental structural biology involved in the chemtrails pathogen, and Vincent works closely with Clifford Carnicom and the staff there to accomplish this task. Our topics today is chemtrails, Morgellons, and a new discovery made regarding a new kind of synthetic or artificial life form that has been called a cross-domain bacteria, some pretty bizarre material. Welcome, Vincent. Thank you so much for coming on with us. It's great to talk with you today. Hope everything is good on your end.
Everything's great, thanks.
It's really interesting to have you here. I think this is going to be very interesting. We haven't really gone into this particular topic in detail. We've talked a little bit with Sophia Smallstorm about it, of course, but you have a far more, I think, scientific background to this topic and a way of kind of wrapping this in a different kind of context, if you will. But tell us a little bit about how you got onto this and a little bit about your background, Vincent, if you will.
Well, sure. I studied biochemistry as well as a discipline called bioinformatics. And what that is it's the study of how biology and computers interact, so sort of calculating biology with computers. And I did work for a while at the National Institutes of Health, NIH, doing basic sort of molecular research in microscopy, which is looking at things under microscopes, but very expensive microscopes that take up an entire room. But so I did some of that, and then I went into the defense world, into the military-industrial complex. And although I'd love to have inside info on this particular aerosol spraying chemtrails thing, unfortunately I didn't work on any of those programs in particular. But I did work on other programs at, in some of these top 50 defense contractors, mostly related to, the whole spying type thing on the public and aggregating social media and analyzing it and trying to figure out, population trends and how people react, mass psychology, that sort of thing. But you can sort of see by pulling back the curtain the amount of money that's thrown at control in all of its forms, whether it's aerosols in the air or control of the internet, control of people's thoughts and their perceptions. So I saw that through the military-industrial complex, and one day I stumbled on Clifford Carnicom's site, and I looked up in the sky, and I realized, I had a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, and I realized that this was real, that that they were spraying the air. And so my journey since then was to figure out why. And that was probably six years ago. I realized that, maybe a little more. And just recently, over the past several months, 3 months perhaps, I've decided to really, go full force on this. Just my conscience has compelled me. So I got in touch with Clifford, and am now working very closely with Clifford Carnicom from the Carnicom Institute to do the basic scientific research and to try to accelerate it. So that's sort of my background and where I'm at. And, we talk every week, Clifford and I, and more than once a week. And really the goal now at the Carnicom Institute is to focus not on this geoengineering so much, not that it's not important, but to focus on the bioengineering. because people post about HARP and weather, owning the weather in 2025, which is a paper by the Air Force, and all of that is true. It's not
Right.
that it's not true. It's just that the bioengineering is really the more serious matter of the two, and it goes to the core of life itself and the process of life. So that's why I'm involved with Carnicom Institute as well as my own research. And the goal here, I think, is we're trying to reverse engineer the structural biology of this chemtrails pathogen, if you will, and to figure out the components, its life cycle, what is it made out of, and so forth. And then down the line, that's connected to Morgellons, but we're looking at the, smallest, most basic units of what it's made out of, not, the highest, nanomachine, type stuff it's making. We're looking at the smallest things we can to try to analyze those. So that's basically where I'm at and where the research is at.
Vincent sure sounded comfortable, didn't he? He was cool as a cucumber and sounded like he could have taken a Xanax or Propofol to calm his nerves. But it's more likely that he's simply adept at being interviewed and sharing information on these and other topics. I certainly always found him to be a great communicator with a calm demeanor. This appearance on Red Ice Radio was, however, the point at which I began to wonder about Vincent, and the point at which things began to get weird. When I visited the Red Ice Creations website to listen to Vincent's interview, I was somewhat taken aback to see the imagery chosen and the photo supposedly depicting Vincent. My gut was telling me the photo was of someone else, but I just couldn't put my finger on it. So I did something that at that point I had yet to do. I Googled the name Vincent Freeman. In only a few minutes, I determined the photo used to depict Vincent was actually Ethan Hawke, the actor. I couldn't help but feel a bit stupid when I further learned that Ethan Hawke had been the lead character in a film called Gattaca, in which he played a character named Vincent Freeman. I was quickly coming to the obvious conclusion that Vincent was only a pseudonym so that he could work for Clifford anonymously. Aside from thinking it was a little weird that nobody found it odd that a representative of Carnicom Institute had been presented using the identity of a character from a sci-fi movie, I figured I had assessed the situation and didn't look into it any further. I later spoke about this realization with the friend I had put Vincent in touch with earlier, mostly to point out my own foolishness and the comical nature of the situation. But soon after, this person called me claiming to have learned Vincent's real name. It sounded pretty preposterous, but I listened as they explained further. They explained that they used a local email application mostly, but sometimes used their email provider's web-based email service to access their mail. They said they were very familiar with how SMTP and IMAP email worked, and how this specific web-based email service worked. They had received email from Vincent at his vincent@biocode.info address previously in their local mail application, but later sent and received a couple messages using the web-based service. Neither had populated the email contact with Vincent's name, Vincent Freeman, or anything else. Then, after logging back into the webmail service, they noticed Vincent's message included not just his email address, but a name as well. The name was Cecil Lasich. I provided some help in determining for sure that what they were seeing wasn't being misinterpreted, but it checked out. I wanted to do some research of my own, so we ended our call and I began to do some research into the name Cecil Lasich, a very unexpected and uncommon sounding name. As it turned out, the name is very uncommon and appeared to relate to only one person in the United States. The name was connected to a business in Ohio entitled CJL Technology Services, LLC. My friend suggested that I call the number listed and speak with Cecil to determine if it was in fact Vincent, but I thought it better to wait and see if we weren't just confused about what we were seeing. They persisted and then offered to call the number themselves, which they then hung up and proceeded to do. When they called back, they explained that it went to voicemail where a man who wasn't Vincent left the outgoing message. They seemed sure that it wasn't him after having spoken at length with him on a couple of occasions, but for whatever reason they encouraged me to call and hear for myself. So I called the number, planning to simply explain I had dialed the wrong number if anyone answered, but got the voicemail as well. In my opinion, it was Vincent. I was nearly sure of it and figured my friend was simply not as familiar with his voice as I was. I continued my research into Cecil Lassich for the remainder of that afternoon. The next day, my friend called me back to see if I had learned anything else. I pointed out the similarities in choice of color, simplicity, and focus on circular shapes in both the logos of CJL Technology Services and of Vincent's website BioCode. But it turned out that my friend had a surprise for me. I don't remember what the reason they gave was, but for some reason they had called the number again, but the number had been disconnected. Up to that point, I had considered it very possible that this was all a fluke, and there was no connection between the names Cecil Lassich and Vincent. But the number at CJL being disconnected the very day after our calls confirmed that we were onto something. I had even considered that my friend was for some reason messing with my head and maybe even made up the name Cecil Lassich, but that possibility seemed far too remote at that point. After some thought, I decided to contact a fellow employee at Carnicom Institute whom I trusted for advice about how to proceed. My concern was that Clifford's organization may have been infiltrated by someone with an entirely different purpose than the one they claimed to have. Had Clifford been duped by Vincent? Did Clifford even know the true identity of Vincent? The fellow employee and I decided it was best to simply compile what evidence we had and email it to Clifford for his consideration, which we did. It was either at this time or possibly earlier that I learned Vincent was primarily intent on replicating Clifford's research in the laboratory step by step. A reference to this could be found on Vincent's website where he states, quote, "This will allow replication of the experiments of the Carnicom Institute to allow independent confirmation as well as enable new analysis," unquote. I'm not sure how someone working within the Institute and replicating Clifford's research could constitute independent confirmation, though. A couple days later, we received an email from Clifford in which he expressed thanks for looking out for the group and suggesting that the fellow employee and I schedule a web conference with Vincent to ask him about our findings directly. This was totally unexpected, as I thought at minimum Clifford would choose to brief us both on what he knew and could share about Vincent. I certainly didn't expect that he would recommend that we confront Vincent with our findings directly. Reluctantly, I scheduled a conference call between the three of us, and Vincent agreed. When Vincent joined the call, he sounded agitated somewhat, and maybe even defensive. I began by explaining all the ways in which we could have simply misunderstood the information, and explained how it was fully understandable and reasonable that he might choose to work with the group anonymously. I was, at the start of the call, intent on not revealing the name Cecil Lassich, not sure if it might either act as a bargaining chip somehow or otherwise force Vincent's hand. Vincent revealed more of what we already knew about his past, including more specifics about his work for various military contractors. I was somewhat surprised to hear that he had recently worked for a company that published airplane and helicopter manuals and related materials. That was a connection to the aeronautics industry, which was interesting considering the work we were all doing in research of aerosol spraying by aircraft. After a while, Vincent seemed less agitated, and the conversation continued. Feeling that the primary question of his identity would remain an issue if he was in fact Cecil Lassich, I first asked if he was located in Ohio or if he had his own company, to which he replied no. Finally, I asked if he had ever heard the name Cecil Lassich, to which he replied no and specified that it wasn't him or a name that he had used. At one point, he excused himself for a moment and sounded like he was speaking to someone. When he returned, he said something about his girlfriend and then later mentioned his girlfriend again. I found that inconsistent as he had previously mentioned his wife. Ultimately, Vincent denied any knowledge or use of the name Cecil Lassich, but admitted that he was using an alias in order to protect himself from anyone from his past knowing of his work with Carnicom. Me and the other Carnicom employee were satisfied that he had answered our questions as completely as he could, as could be expected, and we both expressed that there was no animosity or bad blood between us. Vincent asked that we not share what we had found with any other parties, especially at Carnicom Institute, to which we agreed. It was decided that it would only serve to demoralize the group. Even still, Vincent said he planned to lay low for a couple of weeks, but that he planned to continue his collaboration with Carnicom ultimately. After the call ended, I spoke for a few minutes with the other Carnicom employee, and we both restated how our questions had been answered and how we had no further reason to be suspicious of Vincent. But the next day, as I was thinking about what to explain to Clifford, I began to realize that my suspicions persisted. Just because Vincent had detailed a work history that didn't fit with that published about Cecil Lassich in the past or present didn't mean Vincent wasn't Cecil. His denials also didn't resolve the issue that the outgoing voicemail recording at CJL sounded like Vincent. I began to think that we had both been swayed by Vincent that we were wrong, without his providing any proof. Nevertheless, we reported to Clifford that it was likely a misunderstanding, that Vincent had answered our questions and we were going to drop the issue. Vincent continued working with the group, but more often directly for and with Clifford. As he had stated, his intent was to replicate all of Clifford's research up to and including his recent DNA work. It appeared to me that Vincent had done just that, or had very nearly done so. I was copied on correspondence in which Vincent detailed his progress and followed his blogging about it as well. A few months passed, and then Clifford made the announcement in our regular conference that Vincent was no longer working with the group. As I recall, he explained in essence that Vincent could no longer be reached. I can only assume that Clifford likely made unsuccessful attempts to reach Vincent. And now I move to the final act or chapter of this strange situation. Not surprisingly, there are a few equally bizarre aspects yet to reveal. At least it's difficult for me to wrap my head around. Even now, I'm baffled and still don't know with confidence who Vincent was or what his purpose was. But there are a few things I can say about Vincent that I feel obliged to, and there are a few related topics that deserve to be covered briefly. The first being that Vincent exhibited many great qualities, some of which I've touched on earlier. This is probably the biggest factor preventing me from declaring him to be some kind of intelligence operative or some other agent with nefarious intent, although I think the possibility remains. I've racked my brain trying to come up with other possibilities with little luck. I equate to some degree intelligence operatives to law enforcement agents, aside from how I imagine they can differ in obvious ways. For instance, intelligence operatives might be highly specialized and in areas that have nothing whatsoever to do with law enforcement. Still, I think most can be categorized as statists or possibly antisocial or immoral. After all, both law enforcers and intelligence operatives are deceitful as a rule, and I couldn't detect any of these characteristics in Vincent. Then there's the matter of Clifford's relationship with Vincent and the impact he had, both positive and or negative, on the work of Carnicom Institute. For me, the question still remains, has Vincent somehow sabotaged Carnicom's plans for now or in the future? I simply can't say. But my relationship with Clifford and the Institute is non-existent at present. Not long after Vincent departed, I departed as well and did not explain why or reply to any emails or telephone messages since. I've chosen for the time being to keep the reasons why I no longer work with the group private. But I do think it's important to stress that in no way do I blame Clifford for my leaving, and it had nothing to do with anything Clifford did specifically. In fact, I have a lot of respect for Clifford and admire him a great deal. I don't hesitate one bit to say this, despite what has and will continue to be said by some agitators out there. I have nearly as much respect and admiration for all the people I was fortunate to have worked with at Carnicom Institute as well. I wish them the best and hope very much that the plans and overall efforts set forth by Clifford are successful and bear fruit. Clifford is in a very tough spot for too many reasons to even mention. You can imagine, though, what it takes to run an organization without providing any saleable products or services, working exclusively in areas known to be opposed by the government at large, with heavy reliance upon both the work of volunteers and generous donations to even stay afloat. And it's very hard to construct the right public message so that the public is encouraged to donate, As it stands, even with great effort to tailor the scope of the work and to explain the purpose of that work so the public can understand is exceedingly difficult. Yet despite all of this, Clifford appears to be forging ahead. Another important point to make is that for a number of years now, Clifford Carnicom has been focused on bioengineering and less so on geoengineering. That means that what Clifford, myself, and others did, and still do, is far less related to the chemtrail phenomenon. The very word itself is somewhat loaded and possibly even inaccurate depending on your perspective. A more suitable alternative is persistent contrail, although there may be others. Very briefly, what Clifford began to focus on years ago wasn't aerosol spraying or any geoengineering impact of that, but what may be contained in that aerosol and the possible biological impact. And Clifford has documented his discovery of Morgellons-related biology or forms in the fallout of persistent contrails. But the significance of the mere existence of the Morgellons form became a priority and has remained so. Through very meticulous, careful, and chronological research and experimentation, Clifford was able to isolate the Morgellons-related form in its earliest known state before becoming any number of larger forms more typical of the Morgellons condition, the fiber-like filaments, for example. What he then discovered was that this early form of the biology, if it's even entirely biological, was infecting red blood cells in humans. Worse still, it was infecting animal blood cells and even plant cells. Think about that for a moment. Nearly all living things on Earth are at risk of being infected by this form. More concerning still is that Clifford began to record positive results for this infection in everyone tested. When I left the Institute, the last major discovery that Clifford detailed in a few research papers available on his website was this infection present across all domains of life. Therefore, he chose the term cross-domain biology, or CDB, to refer to it. I encourage the viewer to visit carnicominstitute.org or to visit the YouTube channel and see for yourself why I think Clifford's work is really above the fold. Merely scanning the titles of the hundreds of research papers is probably enough to pique your curiosity. But let's return now to the primary topic of this video report, Vincent Freeman. As I explained, the name Cecil Lasich was derived through some unknown means as being connected to Vincent through his email address, vincent@biocode.info. That triggered my research into Cecil Lasich. Allow me to trace just the key steps I took to demonstrate how the mystery became even deeper. Here's the only LinkedIn profile for a Cecil Lasich. I won't bother to point out all of what it contains, but here are a few key points. First, we learn that Cecil has been in the Navy and was a submariner, which I confirmed through other records on the internet. We also see he's affiliated with a company called iThreads, which provides corporate and promotional embroidering services. We can determine from a number of other jobs listed that Cecil is experienced in manufacturing and related aspects, including sales and repair of manufacturing equipment. He has a master's in human resources management, but also is a Microsoft certified systems administrator. But the key data point we find in his profile is his connection to CJL Technology Services LLC, a company he founded. Here's a screenshot of that site, which we've seen previously. The company appears to be in Waldron, Michigan. Here's that location in Google Earth. Point of note, when I originally researched this and visited this site 2 years ago, the company was located in Ohio. Here's a data site I found that shows the business in Pioneer, Ohio. The current site displays a Michigan address, but still displays an Ohio phone number. That seemed interesting to me, so I did an Internet Archive search for the website. There were a few versions of the site in recent years, and this version recorded in February 2004. Unfortunately, the archive didn't capture any images which might help us, but the page clearly shows CJL Tech. However, oddly, the business being pitched is an auction website called whybidmore.com. In fact, the site makes no reference to any technology-related services like those advertised on the current site. The company is also shown with an address in Kensington, Maryland, not Ohio or even Michigan. But strangest of all, and something that really flipped everything upside down, is that the name listed as proprietor of CJL Technology Services is Dr. Christopher J. Labuda. Now think about this for a second. What theory were you operating on as to what CJL stood for? I can honestly say that I had assumed it was short for Cecil J. Lasage. In fact, that name is connected to the company dozens of times in records online. Only the website itself omits any reference to Cecil. But suddenly, we see the true owner and operator of the company is a Dr. Christopher J. Labuda? Are you beginning to see how something deceptive is likely going on here? In fact, I believe we've encountered an information impasse in which information is conflicting. But hold on to that thought for a moment as we look at one other item. One of the Internet Archive copies of the site displayed an 800 number for a period. I searched for records of the number online and found this. On some telephone information site, the number is listed but shows the connected address as Tribune, Kansas. This could, however, just be an insignificant glitch. I returned to Google Earth as I had in my earlier research to view the address in Pioneer, Ohio. Here's that address. For some reason, the first thought I had was that it seemed an ideal location for anyone wanting to avoid unexpected visitors. I'm sure that at night, any vehicle could be heard approaching for a good distance. Would it surprise you to learn that, for some reason, Google's Street View image quality of the buildings at this site is far worse than it was when I first looked 2 years ago? I can say with certainty that the images depict the same scene at the same time based on the vehicles present. As I recall, the building on the left is iThreads, but I can't recall what sign on the building on the right reads. But let's not forget that we have yet to learn more about one Dr. Christopher J. Labuda. So let's look at his LinkedIn profile. We can be sure that it's the same Labuda connected to CJL Technology Services, as it too lists whybidmore.com. That makes things easier. But what stands out to me right away is right at the top of the profile, Behavioral Pharmacology Consultant. Recall that Vincent was acutely familiar with pharmacology and various pharmaceutical companies from his interview on Red Ice Radio. Under previous employers, we see National Institute of Mental Health. Vincent specified that he had worked for the, quote, National Institutes of Health, unquote. Is that not technically a match? If not, then what are the odds that these similarities would exist in both characters' career histories? So there it is. What do we truly have connecting the man going by the name Vincent Freeman to the name Cecil Lasage? Well, for starters, it appears that they are both names used only to suit a purpose and probably not anyone's real name. In other words, both Vincent and Cecil appear comfortable with pseudonyms. Other than that, we have just my testimony that the voice on the outgoing voicemail message at CJL sounded like the person I knew as Vincent. I'm not sure what my next step should be, if any. It seems more likely now that the right thing to do would be to get back in touch with Clifford Carnicom to share what additional information I've learned. Maybe then he might be better able to assess whether Vincent Freeman had helped or hurt his organization. I'm still firmly on the fence. But being in this position is nothing new to me. Oftentimes, my research into unusual or conspiratorial topics leaves me in this conclusion limbo. There's not much left to say except thank you for watching.